Welcome to everyone who's joining us for week 5 of our Black Reconstruction seminar. Thanks in particular to those who have sacrificed the beautiful weather to be here in the space with us, to be online with us. We really appreciate it. And we know that with the warmth and the daylight savings time, we are asking a lot of you to sacrifice your Monday evenings, but we really appreciate it. And as a reminder for those who maybe haven't been with us the whole time, this is a part of Abolition School, W.B. Du Bois Movement School for Abolition and Reconstruction in Philadelphia, where we do education grounded in 4 basic principles, namely that we are abolitionists, we are internationalists, we do intersectional education, and we do participatory education. And we established the school with an understanding of, the kind of political education that's necessary around questions of abolition today, and specifically grounded in the idea and the insistence that to be an abolitionist is to be a revolutionary and is to sort of deepen and expand and organize for revolutionary change, right? So that's part of why we're here, and more specifically because this book is really at the heart of why we understand abolition the way that we do in this country, and that's part of why we're spending so much time engaging with it. So again, thank you all for being here. We begin, as we usually begin, with some recap of conversations that we had last week. And last week we talked about chapter 4 on the general strike. Of course, a very pivotal chapter, a chapter, as we talked about, on action, on the ways in which enslaved people sprung into action when the Civil War began, entered into what Du Bois understood as a great general strike against slavery, 500,000 people walking off the job, leaving the plantations, and determining the outcome and the meaning of war. We talked about the ways in which it was sort of paradoxical that Du Bois talks and spends so much time talking about meaning in that chapter, in a chapter about action, but he's very concerned with this question of meaning, and that's going to continue into the chapter that we talk about today. But first and foremost, the reason that Du Bois centers the question of meaning is precisely because the Civil War was not meant to be a war against slavery from day one, right? It was meant to be a war in some ways for slavery, for the U.S. South and for the power of slavery. But for the North, it was not a war against slavery at all. We'll deepen some of that in this chapter. We'll even talk more about that question in the next chapter, looking backward. But the chapter on the general strike is precisely about how the meaning of the Civil War transformed and shifted so quickly. As Du Bois puts it in the very first paragraphs, he said, when the armies entered the South, the Union armies, they became armies of emancipation. It was the last thing they intended to be, right? So a very important and dramatic shift in meaning that we're trying to explain in this chapter through the action of the general strike. What did the general strike do, as we talked about last week? First and foremost, it withdrew essential labor from the U.S. South. That labor had given the South a dramatic advantage in the war, what appeared to be an insurmountable advantage, namely the fact that they could have an army on the front line and have food being grown in the fields, right, because of enslaved Black labor. That advantage suddenly becomes an Achilles heel when that labor walks away, right? When suddenly the South has to, as Du Bois puts it, withdraw troops from the front lines or starve. So this is a crucial piece. The general strike then bestowed some of that labor to the Northern armies, right, as cooks, as cleaners, as varieties of manual labor at first, then as spies and scouts, which is an incredibly important function that formerly enslaved people played for the Northern armies, and finally as soldiers. And we're going to talk centrally today about the question of Black soldiers and why they matter for the war effort. And it's not a simplistic answer. So that's part of the sort of foreground of what we're going to be talking about. And finally, and as a result of this withdrawal and bestowal of Black labor, we talked about the ways in which it was the general strike itself, in other words, the self-activity of formerly enslaved people, that dictated both the outcome and the meaning of the war. We also, though, talked about the ways in which Du Bois, precisely when he's dealing with this question of meaning, is also dealing with questions of consciousness. And he emphasizes the fact that this didn't mean that there was this sort of sudden and clear consciousness or this organized plan for this general strike. He's pushing back here on a certain understanding of the general strike as something that's organized, planned from above, established through communication channels. None of that was available to enslaved people, as he argues, and therefore this general strike looked different, and it wasn't built on this sort of all or nothing style consciousness of absolute clarity, but it was based on the actions and the interpretation of hundreds of thousands of people of their own circumstances for Du Bois. Communication according to what channels they have, but those weren't many, and so it was really very much a question of what action and what moment will get me closer to freedom, and the fact that hundreds of thousands of people took that action at the same moment constituted this generalized strike. So Du Bois is on the one hand stretching our understanding of what a general strike means, first and foremost by placing enslaved people, what he calls the black worker, right? Already stretching the concept of worker and therefore the question of strike, placing them at the center of this action, the general strike. But secondly, by transforming a little bit and adjusting our understanding of what that means in terms of organization and consciousness, right? This is a little more spontaneous. It's certainly something that doesn't emerge in precisely the way that a general strike by industrial workers would be predicted to play out. And I did want to add, because I mentioned a piece last week, but I didn't have the citation right there. But there's a really interesting piece that came out just a couple of years ago by Joseph Albernaz, and it's called Abolition, Black Ultra-Radicalism in the Generation of the General Strike. And it shows, as I sort of hinted at last week, that the person who's often credited with formulating the very idea of the general strike originally had himself drawn upon ideas put forward by a friend of his who was a Black Jamaican abolitionist, who himself was responding in many ways to the Haitian Revolution. So first and foremost, the idea of the general strike has its origins in abolition, right? So it's not only that we're taking a concept that is designed for industrial workers and applying it to Black workers, right? It's that the concept has this sort of hidden, invisible background and content in Black struggle in the Haitian Revolution, right? In attempts to understand the Haitian Revolution. Now, there's a kind of consistency to this sort of weird circuit, which is namely the fact that it's very often the case that the unspoken content of certain categories draw for their, that again, unspoken and unstated meaning, draw upon struggles of colonized and enslaved people, right? This is very famously the case with the Haitian Revolution, which we'll talk about, a little bit more, and the ways in which Hegel, in particular, formulates his dialectics through an unacknowledged centering and influence of the Haitian Revolution. We can also think about it more generally, though. We can think about the ways in which the Haitian Revolution itself was the reception, in some ways, of French revolutionary categories of liberty, equality, fraternity, right? Named in the Declaration of the Rights of Man in the French Revolution, but those are landing in Haiti, and enslaved people are saying, well, what does liberty, equality, and fraternity mean to me? And so it's like the appropriation of this category that's derived from the European context, but also the transformation, because liberty, equality, fraternity for an enslaved Haitian means something much more concrete than the sort of metaphor of liberty, equality, and fraternity that's often internalized as a result of the French Revolution. These categories become more material and concrete when they're in the hands of actually enslaved people, right? The chains are not metaphors, the chains are real, right? So you've got a few interesting things going on here. Now, from the perspective of, again, talking a little bit about Hegel, who again formulates an early understanding of idealist dialectics, this becomes the basis for Marx to talk about a materialist dialectics of working class struggle. But the very core, as I mentioned a couple of chapters ago, the very core of this for Hegel emerges in this brief set of pages in the phenomenology called the master-slave dialectic. And this chapter we're talking about today is very crucial for the questions raised by Hegel's master-slave dialectic. And so I'm going to get in the weeds for just a couple of minutes about this, but don't worry too much. We'll come back to the concrete piece and we'll come back to Du Bois. Just super quick and dirty master-slave dialectic for Hegel. Hegel understands and formulates this, this encounter between two individuals because he's trying to explain an understanding of the importance of struggle for the development of self-consciousness, right? He describes this through an encounter of individuals, but what he means is far broader about the ways in which when we stand up and fight, when we risk our lives for something, something more important, we set off a process that leads to the development of mutual self-consciousness and the generalized expansion of that self-consciousness. He's trying to explain the broad dynamics of world history, but he's trying to explain it through this individual encounter in which these two sort of humans clash with each other, engage in conflict and struggle. One is defeated and is enslaved, and the other is victorious and becomes the master, enslaving the other. The key, though, and I mentioned this previously, is that while the master therefore appears to be powerful, sovereign, kind of individual, appears to be the independent party in this struggle by virtue of being victorious and being more powerful, Hegel's conclusion is actually that the opposite is true. The person who is enslaved is forced to labor, right? That person is laboring on the world. They're doing the work. They're engaging in material reality. Whereas the master is actually buffered from that material reality. They are mediated, their relationship with the world. They don't engage with the world directly. And if anything, they're dependent on that enslaved person for their connection to the world. And so it's the enslaved person in Hegel's formulation who actually gains a greater degree of true independence and true sovereignty through the process. Now, we mentioned this, a little bit and we mentioned it specifically in the context of the planter, right? The chapter prior to the general strike. Why? Because we were talking about the decadence of the planter and enslaving class, right? Again, doesn't labor, doesn't know what it means to labor, often doesn't know what the organization of labor means or how it is arranged, right? This is part of what Marx will say about the workers and the bosses, right? The workers are the ones that know how the factory operates, right? And Hegel is here saying something very similar. And what we saw was the way in which that led to a certain kind of consciousness in the planter that was decadent, lazy, that was dedicated toward consumption rather than production, right? We saw all of these kind of the deformations of consciousness that this generated. At the risk of going deeper, I will say, I want to add just one more idea, which will be reworked a bit by Du Bois in this chapter. And that's what Hegel calls the cunning of reason, or the cunning of reason in history. And for Hegel, this is about the ways in which the sort of chaos that we see all around us, all of the complicated and contradictory struggles, individual interests, conflicts that we see happening, everywhere, have within them and are threaded together by a kind of invisible logic of history, right? We could think, for example, of the way that, like, even Martin Luther King speaks of the arc, the arc of history, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, right? The idea that despite all of these things happening all around us, there's some justice, there's some level of consciousness, there's some what Hegel would call reason or rationality or mind that is built into this movement of history. And there's two things I think I would say about that. One, and these parallel what we've said about the master-slave dialectic itself. The first is that Du Bois, like many Black and anti-colonial revolutionaries, find this piece of Hegel to be both very interesting and useful, but also insufficient, right? It's interesting and it's useful because it provides a sort of moral weight and legitimacy to struggles against oppression, to struggles against the irrationality of the world, and it serves to legitimize those struggles. But it's insufficient because colonized and enslaved people, of course, know perfectly well that there's nothing inherently logical or rational about the movement of history, right? They've themselves in their communities seen and witnessed dramatic setbacks and the need for struggle rather than the automatic movement toward greater kind of rationality. Now, again, we talked about one side of the master-slave dialectic in the planter chapter, and the fact that slavery makes the masters disconnected, decadent, delusional, and lazy. In other words, the system of slavery generates the opposite of self-consciousness in certain ways. And we talked about how this delusion in Edward Ruffin, if you remember that figure of Edward Ruffin, propelled the South toward war, right? They couldn't see or figure their way out of it. Here we're talking about, in this chapter, on the coming of the Lord, the other side of that dialectic, the enslaved people themselves, right? Hegel, in his dialectic, never actually talks about slaves fighting back and overthrowing their masters, and there's a sort of split in the sort of interpretations of Hegel, right? On the one hand, there's the invisible backdrop. Hegel was reading about Haiti. He knew that slaves were rebelling. He knew they were fighting back. He never mentions it in this master-slave dialectic, but there are folks that say, of course, that's the conclusion, right? If the enslaved person becomes more independent and gains this consciousness through labor in the world, of course, they eventually overthrow the master. And then there are others that say, no, Hegel wouldn't have interpreted that way. That doesn't necessarily matter to us. But again, what is important and what is crucial is the understanding of the way that consciousness is developed through the course of the struggle. And that, again, is what this chapter is about. Because this chapter is about Black soldiers, it's about guns in Black hands. And as Du Bois says, if you turn to the very first paragraph, it's a pivot in a certain way from the general strike through soldiers in this chapter, again, Black soldiers, and on later, in later chapters, toward the question of free Black labor, right? This is what he says in the first paragraph. How the slaves were transformed in part from laborers to soldiers fighting for their own freedom, and in succeeding chapters we'll treat the organization of free labor after the war. So here the pivot is the question of soldiers. Again, hold on to the idea we mentioned a couple weeks ago that not all enslaved people who walked off joined the Union Army, right? They are not limited, they were not limited and not constrained to the idea of being a worker for capital, much less were they constrained to the idea of being a fighter for the Union, right, and for the US government. That's all to say we don't want to foreclose on the other things people were building, the other experiments in sort of socialist, sort of collective economics, or the ways in which many people probably weren't loyal at all to the US government. The number of enslaved people who left and abandoned the US to fight on the side of the British in the War of 1812, this is precisely because, of course, you're not loyal to a system that holds you as, as a slave. But we'll, bracket that a little bit and center this question, this crucial question of what it means for formerly enslaved people to be soldiers and to become soldiers. And again, it's going to be a complicated answer here. The second paragraph, Du Bois speaks of emancipation, right? He speaks of the proclamation itself. Of course, we're talking about January 1863, issued 6 months prior in a sort of a preliminary form, and we'll talk about that timing. But what he says is, in the ears of the world, Abraham Lincoln on the 1st of January 1863 declared 4 million slaves thenceforward and forever free. The truth was less than this. It's a very interesting way to put it. The truth was less than this. In part because, first of all, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't technically apply everywhere. But second, and the more important point in certain ways for Du Bois is, as he puts it, hundreds of thousands of such slaves were already free by their own action and that of the invading armies. And in their cases, Lincoln's proclamation only added possible legal sanction to an accomplished fact. Again, key here, enslaved people freed themselves in the hundreds of thousands. And that is the first step in this crucial progression, which transforms the meaning of the war. Now, as we've already seen, though, emancipation was not always Lincoln's position. We're going to dig even more into this in the next chapter, where we see, the sort of ways in which Lincoln's actual fundamental goal initially had been colonization, right? Shipping off all enslaved people to a colony elsewhere in Africa, in Latin America. Lincoln had not always been for emancipation. As late as 1862, he says, and this is over on 85, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union and is not either to save or destroy slavery." He says it very clearly. Right? If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do that. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would also do that. So myth busting in American history 101, Lincoln was not a proponent necessarily of freeing slaves. And so the question again is, why was he backed into the kind of corner that made that mandatory for him? He even writes, right around this sort of period, mid-1862, that he doubted the effectiveness of Black soldiers. He said, "I'm not sure we could do much with the Blacks. If we were to arm them, I fear in a few weeks the arms would be in the hands of the rebels," right? They would fumble them. I don't know. They would hand them over voluntarily. Seems like a strange kind of suggestion. But he is saying, right up until the middle of 1862, he doesn't think either emancipation is required for unity, And he's saying that he doesn't think black soldiers would be a major contribution to the war effort. And so Du Bois is really trying to explain why this about face by Lincoln, right? And he pins it down between these speeches and the initial Emancipation Proclamation to about 9 days. He says within the course of 9 days, Lincoln makes this turn, makes this about face, and issues in September 1862 an initial preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And he asks, what were the motives, right? And he even describes them. He says, what were the ulterior motives? He said, emancipation had two ulterior objects. First and foremost, to replace white troops with black, right? So that becomes one of the fundamental justifications. And secondly, and very crucially, to make the US Civil War into a moral war, which again, it wasn't, right? It wasn't from the perspective of the North. But by taking the moral high ground, making it a war against slavery, it becomes a question of blocking the ability of European nations to recognize the Confederacy and continue to support it. In fact, the European countries had been supporting it, right? Had been supporting the Confederacy. England had been supplying ships to the US South. France, of course, for those that know, had taken advantage of the fact of the Civil War to invade Mexico, right? France had literally landed troops in Mexico, allegedly to collect on debts, on war debts. But the reality is this was an attempt, and it ended up being this extended attempt to project French Catholic sort of like influence into the Western Hemisphere again. We're talking about the vacuum left by the withdrawal of the Spanish in the aftermath of decolonization. And so the French, of course, are not moral actors in this case. They will even institute and impose the great comedy that is Emperor Maximilian, the brief sort of emperor of Mexico, who then is, of course, killed by firing squad when the French invasion fails. But the point is that Europe, and specifically France and England, had been toying with and supporting the Confederacy. Why? Because they wanted the cotton as well. They wanted direct access to the cotton so that they could process it, so they could fuel their industrial development instead of fueling the industrial development of the US North. And Du Bois says there are two crucial constituencies that that are receptive to this idea of emancipation that matter. As Du Bois puts it, this is over on toward the bottom of page 87. Only among Negroes and in England was the reaction favorable to emancipation. And as Du Bois puts it, this is toward the bottom, both counted. Both counted. How did it count in England? He documents the ways in which workers were standing up and supporting emancipation, right? Again, the US reliance on slavery is at this point a kind of anachronism that had been abolished in many other parts of the world. Right? Again, that doesn't mean England abolished slavery for moral reasons. It fundamentally did not, but it had been abolished, and there's a moral argument that's being leveraged, particularly by workers. He documents the ways in which workers' organizations had resisted and put pressure on the English government to not side with the slave confederacy, right? Similar things are happening in France. He's documenting the way that Marx was present. Marx is writing letters to Lincoln at this point and understanding in a pretty nuanced way, actually, the relationship between the emancipation of enslaved people and the emancipation of labor and connecting the two in a very consistent way. That's the first, right? It matters what Europe thinks. And this is crucial for Du Bois. Secondly, it matters what Black Americans themselves think, according to Du Bois. And this is what he says immediately on page 87. The proclamation made 4.5 million laborers willing almost en masse to sacrifice their last drop of blood for their newfound country. It sent them into transports of joy and sacrifice. It changed all of their pessimism and despair into boundless faith. It was the coming of the Lord. This is where we get to the title of the chapter, right? And it comes up in the context of saying, who has the leverage? Who is it that that Lincoln is trying to convince with the Emancipation Proclamation? Whose support is he trying to cement by abolishing slavery on January 1st, 1863? So that's a fundamental question, convincing Europe and convincing formerly enslaved people in the United States. On page 91, he says, in the North, the Emancipation Proclamation meant the Negro soldier. Again, focus on meant, meaning, meant, right? The Emancipation Proclamation meant the Negro soldier, and the Negro soldier meant the end of the war. That's the true mechanism, right? Not only is it the fact that the withdrawal of labor from the South had helped to set this all into motion, right? But it's the fact that the only constituency that then is sort of the bedrock of the victory of the Civil War for the Union is that not only those formerly enslaved people, but as soldiers, right? And that transition to being as soldiers is going to be what Du Bois is trying to chart. Here was indeed revolution. At first, and again, here was indeed revolution. What does that mean? Why is he calling this a revolution? And you can't understand it as a revolution outside of meaning, right? The victory of the US North is not a revolution. What is the revolution? At first, this was to be a white man's war. First, because the North did not want to affront the South, and the war was going to be very short. It was going to be short, very short. And secondly, if Negroes fought in the war, how could it help being a war for their emancipation? And for this, the North would not fight. Yet scarcely a year after hostilities started, the Negroes were fighting, although unrecognized as soldiers. In 2 years, they were free and enrolling in the army. Here indeed was revolution. So you've got the question on the one hand of meaning, right? A revolution in meaning. And you've got the question of the ways in which, and this will become crucial as we begin to understand Reconstruction and its defeat, the role of force as an intermediary, right? You could say people are free all day long. The story of Reconstruction, right, is you can say people are free all day long. If there's no force to back that up, it's meaningless. Here you have sort of the inverse, which is to say, prior to people being free, there was a force that emerged and a force that was in place. In these kind of like complicated master-slave dialectics, you have this sort of repeating theme of the ways in which freedom in fact versus freedom in law. That's how Douglass puts it. Frederick Douglass, in his autobiography, talks about when he fought the slave master Covey. He resisted. He decided one day he stood up and fought back, right? He was still enslaved, right? But he says in his autobiography, in that moment, I was free in fact, or free in spirit, even though I may have been slave in fact, right? Again, we're talking about that piece in the master-slave dialectic when you're talking about the development of internal self-conscious and freedom and liberation, even if the form of slavery still exists. So you have this complex overlapping of freedom and slavery in both of these cases. Now we see in this chapter that the progression toward Black soldiers was a very complicated one, right? It was not one that many in the North were willing to recognize. In many cases, it's very interesting because it was generals and high military officials that are actually providing the pressure toward the arming of Black soldiers. You could see this in part because some were actually abolitionists. He mentions that some of these generals were close to John Brown. They had been part of the abolitionist movement. They were radical abolitionists. That's why they were fighting. But part of it was really just that they were the ones who knew the material necessities of the war, right? There's this great quote somewhere in the text where he says, we need to treat our enemies as enemies, right? Meaning, put any and all weapons onto the battlefield, right? They were also the first to see the effectiveness and be able to sense the effectiveness of Black soldiers, right? Which had been doubted widely. Again, built into white supremacy is the idea that not only would enslaved people not want to fight for freedom, but that they wouldn't be very effective at it, right? That they maybe were menial labor, but not organized mental conceptual labor. These are understandings that are still with us, right? Until very, very recently. Look at football, look at the fact that quarterbacks had been white until not that long ago. Why? Because they were understood to be the thinking members of the army, right? They were the ones who were capable of organizing, strategizing, and engaging in that work. But what ironically, the generals in the Civil War began to understand was that enslaved people had understanding and knowledge that the armies did not have, right? Specifically what? They had knowledge of the terrain, right? They had knowledge of the ground, the pathways. The Underground Railroad itself is a form of knowledge of terrain that only enslaved people had. The people whose feet actually touched the ground were the ones that understood how that territory operated and how it worked. At one point on page 93, this is actually really great. Quote, this is General Hunter, right? He sends back this letter. He says, no regiment of fugitive slaves has been or is being organized in this department. There is, however, a fine regiment of loyal persons whose late masters are fugitive rebels. And in fact, if you go, further down, it says, I've clothed, equipped, and armed the only loyal regiment yet raised in South Carolina, Georgia, or Florida. In other words, re-signifying what these black soldiers meant. But the point is very interesting, right? It's that the generals had to be the ones pushing this, right? Had to be the ones on the ground they were actually literally breaking, the regulations and the rules at the time by arming black soldiers. And then they were saying, look at how effective these soldiers are. Look how well they fight. Look at how loyal they are. They're the only loyal regiment raised in the South. And they were a massive success. When when New Orleans or Louisiana was under attack, as what one general put it, they called on Africa for their defense, and they were victoriously defended. Right? All of this is happening in the direct run-up to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the original preliminary proclamation. And here Du Bois discusses briefly another crucial role that came even in some ways before the function of black soldiers, which was the role of black spies. And it's very important because it's a crucial example of what I call both the colonial blind spot and also following Du Bois and building on Du Bois, the second sight of the colonized and enslaved. By this, I mean the fact that it's not only to say that black spies existed for the Union Army. That is true. But what is being said is actually far, far more important, which is that enslaved black people could be spies because they were black, because of the white supremacy that said, we can have these people in our home. They won't be plotting against us. They are not smart enough to be plotting against us. They're not organized or sort of dedicated enough to the cause. And yet you have these incredible examples of black spies who had photographic memories, who, could go literally into the houses of Jefferson Davis. A spy was stationed, memorize plans for battles, and then, go and report those to a resistance network that existed for, for black spies. There was I believe in Norfolk, Virginia, there's a very famous case of, black spy stealing the plans for an ironclad steamship, right? And smuggling those out to the Union side. And all of this takes advantage of, weaponizes the blind spot that prevents the Confederacy from understanding these people as people, right? So it's built into, and that's what's key for me always, it's built into the structure of, white supremacy. This extends to roles as scouts and then as soldiers. Again, the people that literally knew the terrain, that knew the hidden pathways, who actually walked it. This is why they were good soldiers, and many actually led attacks on their own former plantations. Right? They knew exactly what to do. They knew how to approach. They knew the best ways to do it. They knew who would be on duty in terms of, in terms of protecting it. And it's crucial to understand and to establish this sort of through line between this form of consciousness and struggle and the advantages, the paradoxical advantages of all guerrilla struggle, right? Because the point precisely of guerrilla struggle is to invert the material balance of forces, right? You have a modern, well-equipped army, and yet you have a sort of ragtag group of people who that don't have the same level of weaponry, and all they have is numbers, dignity, and dedication to their own liberation, which is crucial, and a powerful knowledge of the terrain, right? And that knowledge, that special knowledge, that second sight is incredibly crucial to understanding how guerrilla warfare throughout history against slavery, against colonialism, has always worked. And so gradually, those who walked off the plantations, many of them became soldiers. And Frederick Douglass, who was definitely skeptical and cynical about Lincoln's sudden about face, about the incorporation all of a sudden of formerly enslaved people as soldiers, insisted that it was not surprising at all, right? He was not surprised at the victory, at the successes. And as he put it, I'm trying to find this, on page 101, this is Douglas reflecting on this effectiveness. He refers to it as, he speaks of events more mighty than men, eternal providence, all wise and all controlling, have placed us in new relations to the government and that government to us. I underline this statement by Douglas because when he says events more mighty than men, it's a gesture toward this thing that Hegel speaks of as the cunning of reason, right? There's something bigger than our individual sort of consciousnesses. There's something bigger than our individual interventions and struggles and conflicts that we're engaged in these moments. There's something bigger about the general strike than the 500,000 individuals, right? There's something guiding that. And one of the questions that Du Bois is trying to ask is, what is that thing? Now, we've said that Du Bois says that there are two main constituencies that help propel emancipation. One is European public opinion, particularly the working class. And the second is formerly enslaved Black people as soldiers in particular, right? So these are the two main constituencies. But then he mentions one constituency that does so, again, with a kind of eye to this question of cunning of reason in history and unanticipated effects. He points to another constituency that does so without meaning to do so, and that is white workers in particular. And we mentioned multiple times in previous chapters the ways that white workers in the North were profoundly beholden to the American blind spot, right? Meaning roughly racism, but more specifically, the ways in which Black struggles for abolition were not comprehensible as labor struggles, right? They were seen as a fundamentally and qualitatively different thing from the working class struggles against so-called wage slavery. As a result of this, many white workers in the North, again, this is sort of a recap, misunderstood the nature of their struggle, right? They mistook individuals for structures, so they were against competition with individual Black people, and misunderstood the fact that their true competition came from a structure of slavery that dragged down all wages, that harmed all sort of conditions of all labor, and blamed enslaved individuals instead, right? Now, the same thing happens during the war with white workers who are opposed on, in certain ways, proletarian grounds, are opposed to fighting a rich man's war, right? They're opposed to the war, responded to this war by targeting and punishing individual Black people, right? In a series of draft riots that often led to race riots and lynching. Again, this is kind of a concrete manifestation of that blind spot and its misunderstanding, right? Which had been playing out in race riots and forms of lynching previously, in the Lombard Street riots in Philadelphia a couple decades before. And this, for Du Bois, of course, is a displacement of class hatred onto racial categories, right? But he does identify it as a sort of proletarian kind of struggle. The irony, though, the historical irony, which is very, very interesting, is that these draft riots in which white workers in the North are saying, we're not going to fight this war, all it did was to cement the absolute centrality and need for Black soldiers, right? So white workers being against the war were a huge part of, again, through this kind of process of historical cunning, of forcing the incorporation of Black soldiers into the army. By proving that it was only Black soldiers that could be counted on. Now, we're going to say a lot more about the deeper meaning, the deeper transformative capacity and implications of what it meant for Black people to fight, right? To pick up arms, to fight for their own freedom. But I did want to pause for a couple of minutes, as we try to do, during our sessions, create a little bit of space for questions, either for you all in the room or on the stream, about broadly this question of how it was that this shift was undertaken toward black soldiers, and in shifting toward black soldiers, toward emancipation. The two are very fused for Du Bois as for Lincoln, right? Which is to say, this had to become an emancipation war because they needed black soldiers. That was, by, far and away the most important sort of mechanism. So do folks have any initial questions either in the chat or here? We do have one in the room.
I have a question about the difference in the white workers in England versus the United States' reaction. Is that really just because slavery has been abolished in the UK for so long? Is it because there's not this perceived competition with black labor? Like it just really is kind of shocking to have that discrepancy.
Yeah. So the question of why workers in the U.S. and in the U.S. North were so much worse, right, on this question. And, you can see Du Bois in this chapter. I encourage people to read closely to the debates, right, because you really see the parameters of this disagreement of the reality, which is a perennial reality, right, that workers in the U.S. are fucking reactionary, right, in ways that would be strange even to English workers, right? This is even more pronounced when you look at people like, like Irish workers, right? Where, again, there's this sort of like very famous speech given by an Irish liberation leader who comes to Boston and gives a speech and says, you all really drank the Kool-Aid. Like, how is it that you all don't understand the fact that you all are colonized people and you've just suddenly, like, on landing in the US, become incorporated into this logic? But that's it, right? The main difference is because there's a logic of white power, right? Which is built on many things, including a logic of settler property, which sets the terms for how workers are then incorporated, right? And again, it's important to understand that this is shifting historical terrain, right? Which is to say, workers who arrive in the US, especially in great migrations from Italy, from Ireland, and elsewhere, they are poor, they're often racialized, they're seen as less than white, they're not fully white, many don't speak English, they're treated incredibly badly. So it's not to say there's an immediate incorporation into whiteness, but it's to say that the terms are very clear from arrival that if you want to be incorporated into this power structure, here's what you need to embrace, right? That overlaps heavily with what Du Bois calls the American assumption, which is this really poisonous kind of bootstraps idea that everyone can accomplish uplift through individual labor and dedication, right? But Du Bois does also, again, if we remember back to the earlier chapters, he does say in this period, a few decades prior to the Civil War, in the US, which is an expanding, sprawling settler territory, right? Because of access to land, this was more true than it had been elsewhere. For example, more true than it was in England, where no one's claiming new land. No one, if anything, people are being displaced off of land, right? So there's a material basis for it too. It's a settler material basis, right? And it shapes ideology and consciousness in a dramatic way. So I think that's the main difference. It's a difference that we see today. It's a difference that has been sort of like present throughout, and it creates a situation where it's like, okay, like how do we get out of this, right? If the basis of consciousness in this country is so poisoned by white settlerism from the beginning, how is it that we build and leverage that? And there are leverage points. Again, Du Bois shows the ways in which, and again, part of this whole story is that it wasn't inevitable that white workers and that poor whites in the South would fall for it, right? There's always elements of sort of proletarian, anti-oligarchic consciousness that are being diverted, right? That are being essentially deflected from their true enemies onto these sort of false enemies. What else?
Okay, so we have a question from the chat that says, on page 93, Du Bois talks about similar black regiments in the West India Islands. Can you say more about this historical context? I assume he's referring to the Caribbean. And on page 93, it's in the third full paragraph.
So page 93, he's talking about the third full paragraph. They will prove invaluable auxiliaries fully equal to the similar regiments so long and successfully used by the British authorities in the West India Islands. Yes. Yeah. It's an interesting paradoxical way to make an argument for black soldiers, right? To say that they, have been used effectively by other troops. But we're also thinking about the fact that, again, we're talking about a post-emancipation period. We're talking about the fact that, and again, it's very interesting that we already flagged one of the important kind of through lines that is unspoken about U.S. history. And this is something that's definitely more generalizable, namely the fact that because this is a slave society, the loyalties of Black Americans were never to be taken for granted as being Americanism, right? Or identifying with the government, or identifying with the Union. In the War of Emancipation, this becomes a very different thing. But it creates a historical complexity, again, where, and again, this is what I had already mentioned, in the War of 1812, enslaved Black people are fleeing to British ships, right? In the American Revolution, enslaved Black people are joining the British side because it's not clear that that's presented to us as the side of emancipation is against the British. The side of emancipation is for this sort of new experiment in so-called democracy, but that's always been cross-cut by the presence of slavery. And so I'm getting a little off the subject, but I just think it's important to understand the fact that the ability and propensity of many enslaved Black Americans to switch sides of loyalties, is a kind of a through line. And that continues. There are very important ways in which the possibility of emancipation creates kind of paradoxical outcomes. I'll point to one which is always very, very interesting to me, which is namely the fact that Frederick Douglass himself, in the aftermath of the US Civil War, is and takes a position that could be understood by us as being imperialist. He supports the US project of annexing territories in the Caribbean and in Haiti in particular, right? But when you look at it, it's because he is hoping and thinking that the US post-Reconstruction will be a force of actual democracy in the world, right? So that's a very interesting cross-cutting through line that I really think is worth emphasizing. And I only bring it up, in response to this question because of this idea that you've got Black troops working with British authorities in the Caribbean, that is not meant to mean that these authorities supporting slavery. This is, again, after abolition. It's not an unambiguous reality. But the point here really is more having to do with the fact that the kind of white supremacy that was still overbearingly present in the US South, which, as we've argued and emphasized before, was doubled down on, was reinforced, was strengthened, became more radically racist in the decades leading up to the Civil War because of the challenges. This is something that had been on the retreat in many other parts of the world, right? Yeah, that's what I would say.
Another question from the chat is, what kind of shift was necessary to move from directing newly emancipated Black slaves from enacting violence in self-defense to arming and uniforming them as soldiers?
What kind of a shift was necessary?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning ideological shift, right? That's the story of this chapter, right? And it's a great question, and it's going to point toward things that we talk about right now. But it's important to emphasize that apparently simplistic question, right? What does it take? Is actually a profoundly important one. Again, because as we've seen up to this point, the resistance to Black soldiers is dramatic, right? It's both we couldn't possibly do that. It's that this would not be acceptable. Again, for example, well, what happens if you start to arm, formerly enslaved Black people? What are the white people going to do? Are they going to refuse to fight? Well, they're already refusing to fight, right? So part of what happens is that what needs to happen concretely is that the North has to be losing the war, right? Or it has to be at threat of losing the war. It has to realize that the necessity lay with the incorporation and the recruitment of Black soldiers, right? And again, that sounds like a very simple thing, and maybe I'm not really getting across the fact that it's a very concrete and obvious thing, but it's something that requires powerful transformations to be happening below the surface, if that makes sense. On the level of ideology, but also on the level of ontology, right? Being, the white supremacy that says that certain people are not fully capable of this or that. as is often true, it starts to happen in practice before the ideas, right? Again, the generals are like, listen, like we have these people bringing us information. There were black spies on the side, and not even spies, right? It almost like exaggerates it to say spies. There were there was a married couple on the Virginia lines where the husband was on the side of the Union, I believe, and the wife was on the side of the Confederate lines, and she was just working, and she would be hanging the laundry upside down or right side up to send messages across to her husband on the side of the Union lines, right? That's not something that she had been recruited to do. It's something that emerges out of practice and is offered to the struggle, right? And so it's that kind of thing where, again, and when you get to the root of that, what are you talking about? You're talking about Black people standing up, throwing in their lot, deciding which side is better for them, and fighting for that side, and making the contribution because they think that's where their interests lay, right? And what Du Bois is emphasizing is the powerfully transformative capacity that had in this moment because of the centrality of enslaved Black people and because of the sort of dynamics of the war as they're unfolding, right? So what I've done is to sort of not really answer the question, but to point toward the ways in which we'll answer it right now. Because the question here is fundamentally, how did freedom come? What determined it? How did it emerge? And how Black troops played a pivotal and contributing role to this, again, not only in the question of who won or lost the war, which is crucial, but the fundamental question of the meaning of the war and how Black people saw themselves and were seen. In other words, the way that Black soldiers contributed to the overarching retreat of white supremacy. On page 104, and then again on 110, but I'll read what he says on 104, I think, very quickly. Du Bois writes, "It had been a commonplace thing in the North to declare that Negroes would not fight. Even the Black man's friends were skeptical about the possibility of using him as a soldier, and far from it being to the credit of Black men or any man that they did not want to kill. The ability and willingness to take human life has always been, even in the minds of liberal men, proof of manhood. This was the proof of manhood required of the Negro." And he almost repeats himself word for word on page 110. This is very crucial, right here on this passage at the top of page 110. And this is just like really one of the most striking passages in this entire book. When Du Bois writes, "How extraordinary and what a tribute to ignorance and religious hypocrisy is the fact that in the minds of most people, even those of liberals, only murder makes men. The slave pleaded, he was humble, he protected the women of the South, and the world ignored him. The slave killed white men, and behold, he was a man." What the fuck is happening here? What is this hypocrisy? What is the content of this transformation? This is the very, very heart of a tragic reality that Du Bois is diagnosing. And it goes right back to this question of the master-slave dialectic. It goes right back to the question of struggle and the need for struggle for the development of mutual self-consciousness, for the setting into motion of a dialectics of liberation that leads toward self-consciousness. Du Bois sees this as a tragedy. What a tribute to ignorance and religious hypocrisy that only murder makes men. But there's a core of it that isn't exactly tragic either, namely that what we're ultimately talking about is what happens not only when we struggle for freedom, as Hegel had discussed again in the master-slave dialectic, but what also happens when we witness others struggling for freedom. Especially when a core belief of white supremacy is that Black people don't want to and are incapable of fighting for freedom. This is not only about the war, it's not only about war in general, and it's not only about slavery. From Watts to Minneapolis, we see how Black struggle has had a dramatic impact on public opinion among most people, among people who just simply witnessed it, people who weren't there, people who were not participating in the struggle. There are these polls that are taken in the 60s, they're taken again in 2020, and they show a dramatic shift in white public opinion about policing, police brutality, its systemic nature. The shift in the aftermath of the Minneapolis rebellions was the biggest shift they'd ever seen on the scale. It was like 20 percentage points in terms of the percentage of white people who saw police brutality and violence as a systemic question rather than an accident, right? And so what's crucial is the power of struggle for freedom to have this kind of demonstration effect and prove to others one's humanity. Now, as Du Bois will show, this was not a permanent shift in the context of Reconstruction. He will try to document the parameters of this retreat of white supremacy and its return and what led to it. And we also know that it wasn't permanent in 2020, right? We know that the temporary nature of particularly liberal sort of sympathy with Black freedom struggles is, of course, noteworthy. But it was crucial nonetheless. And Du Bois is trying to show what it made possible for those shifts to happen. So freedom came through Black soldiers standing up and fighting. And of course, this transforms our understanding of who brought freedom about. Again, we've said this before, but it bears repeating. Who brought freedom about and under what conditions? This is the top of page 121, where Du Bois writes, "It was not the abolitionist alone who freed the slaves." Again, here moving beyond Lincoln, who no one thought was an abolitionist at all, but here he's saying it wasn't even the abolitionists who brought about the freedom of the slaves. The abolitionists never had a real majority of the people of the United States back of them. Freedom for the slave was the logical result of a crazy attempt to wage war in the midst of 4 million Black slaves and trying the while sublimely to ignore the interests of those slaves in the outcome of the fighting. Yet these slaves had enormous power in their hands. Simply by stopping work, they could threaten the Confederacy with starvation. By walking into federal camps, they showed to doubting Northerners the easy possibility of using them as workers and as servants, as farmers and as spies, and finally as fighting soldiers, and not only using them thus, but by the same gesture, depriving their enemies of their use in just these fields. It was the fugitive slave who made the slaveholders face the alternative of surrendering to the North or to the Negroes. And then further down, he said, it was then that abolition came in as a determining factor and itself was transformed to a new democratic movement. Right? That's the broad dynamic. And it's important that he begins with, as he puts it, it was the logical result of the crazy attempt. I'm like, okay, you're putting logic and crazy together in a very interesting way, because again, he's trying to grapple with this question of the cunning of history, right? Of the fact that this seems chaotic, it seems crazy, it seems wild. But of course, there's this kind of underlying logic, which is to say you can't simply carry out a war in the context of enslavement and think that these people don't matter for the outcome, right? And the only way that you can do that is if you're convinced that they don't matter. And again, why? Because you've convinced yourself that they don't matter. So there's tremendous blind spot, tremendous delusion on the part of the planters, on the part of the US South, which had built this structure of understanding that made it impossible to actually grasp reality. And again, we go back to Edward Ruffin, who said, all the things that he knew were wrong, as Du Bois puts it. He knew this, that was wrong. He knew that, it was wrong. And it's important to think about the fact that he says only in the course of this struggle did abolition become a powerful democratic force. And again, this brings us back to something we said at the beginning, namely the fact that at the very beginning of the war, the abolitionists were small in number. And one of the fundamental questions we raised was, how do you go from being a tiny minority to being a majority over the matter of just a couple of years? What kind of dynamics are necessary to make that a reality? And we ask that in the context of the prison, where it seems inconceivable for many people to say, we can live without police, we can live without prisons. It seemed just as inconceivable for many in the South to say we can live without slavery, because they built an entire structure and an entire worldview that was based on the assumption that that was an eternal institution. One thing that abolitionists are doing is denaturalizing those institutions and saying they have not always existed. We can exist in a world without them. And as soon as we begin to propel that, it becomes more and more thinkable the further that we go. So that's part of what we're talking about when we're dealing with this question. And here Du Bois is circling back to the question of meaning and doing so on a higher and more complex level. When 2/3 of the way down that page on 121, he says, this is how freedom came. This is the struggle that brought freedom to enslaved people. And then he says, very interestingly, on the other hand, strangely enough, not as much has been said of what freedom meant to the free. Again, he's like obsessed with this question of meaning. These seem to be concrete questions. They are not concrete questions. They seem to be surface questions. They are not. They're questions of what's going on below the surface, on the level of meaning, and how does meaning transform? Not much has been said about what freedom meant to the freed. And this is what he is going to discuss, because it becomes something far more complex. He speaks of a great song rising, a new song of democracy, of equality. Interestingly, here he's sort of assuaging a bit some of our concerns earlier, where it seemed like Du Bois was talking about American democracy as a true unparalleled experiment. There are moments where in the earlier chapters he seems as if he's overly celebrating US democracy, a democracy that we know was fundamentally racially coded from the very beginning. But he's calling this a new song. He's saying a great new song emerges, and it emerges from the heart of enslaved communities themselves, right? A new freedom, a new song, a Black nation emerging. And then we get to these incredibly interesting passages. Where we see the true complexity of what freedom meant to the freed. It's these two on page 122 and then on 124. On 122, halfway down, Du Bois writes, the mass of slaves, even the more intelligent ones, and certainly the great group of field hands, were in religious and hysterical fervor. This was the coming of the Lord. This was the fulfillment of prophecy and legend. It was the golden dawn after chains of 1,000 years. It was everything miraculous and perfect and promising. For the first time in their life, they could travel, they could see, they could change the dead level of their labor, they could talk to friends and sit at sundown in moonlight, listening and imparting wonder tales. They could hunt in the swamps and fish in the rivers. And above all, they could stand up and assert themselves. That's the heart of the master-slave dialectic of resistance, right? Stand up, assert yourself. What does that mean? What does it do for you as an individual? They need not fear the patrol. They need not even cringe before a white face and touch their hats. And then even more dramatically on 124, but I'll start at the bottom of 123. Again, this is where Du Bois just fully switches gears into this sort of prophetic, poetic mode. Suppose on some gray day as you plod down Wall Street, you should see God sitting on the Treasury steps in his glory with his thunders curved about him. Suppose on Michigan Avenue between the lakes and hills of stone and in the midst of hastening automobiles and jostling crowds, suddenly you see living and walking toward you the Christ with sorrow and sunshine on his face. Foolish talk, all of this you say, of course, and that is because no American now believes in his religion. Its facts are mere symbolism, its revelation vague generalities, its ethics a matter of carefully balanced gain. But to most of the 4 million Black folk emancipated by civil war, God was real. They knew him. They had met him personally in many a wild orgy of religious frenzy or in the black stillness of the night. His plan for them was clear. They were to suffer and be degraded, and then afterwards, by divine edict, raised to manhood and power. And so on January 1st, 1863, he made them free. It was all foolish, bizarre, and tawdry. Gangs of dirty Negroes howling and dancing, poverty-stricken, ignorant laborers mistaking war, destruction, and revolution for the mystery of the free human soul. And yet to these black folk, it was the apocalypse. The magnificent trumpet tones of Hebrew scripture, transmuted and oddly changed, became a strange new gospel. All that was beauty, all that was love, all that was truth, stood on the top of these mad mornings and sang with the stars, and a great human mob shrieked in the wind and tossed its tears upon the sea, free, free, free. First of all, it's just so mind-blowingly moving, incredible prose. The idea of writing like that seems like an impossibility, and here we have it, right? But what is Du Bois doing in this passage? And I say that as an honest question because it's very interesting. I always assumed, right, and particularly in this passage on 124, where he says it was all foolish, bizarre, and tawdry. The first time that I read that, I assumed that it was purely sarcastic, right? That there's something, that Du Bois is mocking the idea of the foolishness, that he's himself sort of, I don't know how to put it, identifying fully with the sort of unlettered, uneducated, formerly enslaved people that had seen this as freedom, that when he sees it as a religious fervor, and this is something that's come up in our conversations already, and I'm glad that it has. So this question of what religion means, to enslaved people in this context of liberation. I'd always read this as a passage in which Du Bois is sort of mocking the idea that this is sort of silly or stupid or a product of lack of education, right? And then in conversations with other people, they're like, no, but like Du Bois is very elitist also. He's very rational. He's German educated, right? Like he studied like philosophy, in Europe, and he, to the very end of his life, had transformed the way that his elitism manifested. But he was never not elitist on some level, right? At the very least on the level of understanding and of his own capacity for rational understanding, right? So the question is, what is Du Bois saying here when he talks about this kind of consciousness that sees emancipation as God, that sees it as God in the flesh, the actual living presence of God, the actual reality of religion embedded in political life, right? And again, I'm asking this as an open question because I think we're somewhere in between, right? Where Du Bois himself is not able to fully put himself in the shoes of someone who had felt and seen emancipation, but at the same time, he is trying to respect that and enunciate it, even though he's enunciating something that is hard for him to understand, right? Namely, this religious frenzy, this religious fervor. So you've got this very, very interesting understanding of, on the one hand, the way that Black soldiers fighting tragically, paradoxically, incomprehensibly allows them to be seen as more human for white people, right? And just as incomprehensibly, in some ways, on the other side, you have his understanding of what the coming of the Lord meant as emancipation, right? And the kind of latitude he's giving it to be something more than just, okay, now we are no longer in a position of legal freedom. It is something that means infinitely more, right? It is something that acquires an apocalyptic and ecstatic meaning for formerly enslaved people. And I think we should connect this to the way that he understands the general strike, right? Again, it's not pure consciousness manifested as organized and rational behavior, but it's the ways in which understanding and feeling and an embrace and a sort of directionality toward emancipation leads hundreds of thousands of people in the same direction, right? The idea that there's a spontaneity here, that there's a different kind of consciousness involved. And the fact that we've talked before about the fact that religion itself in the context of the US South is never just religion, right? It's always freedom songs, it's always maps, it's always coded language about how to escape, about what freedom means, about where sort of the crossing of the Jordan River as a symbol for emancipation, right? The road to Zion, all of these are about escaping slavery through biblical language, right? And so he's operating and circulating in this context of trying to sort of map out what these different pieces mean. And that's something I think that's worth understanding. Now, finally, there's the question of what and who was freed by emancipation. Page 125. All the way at the bottom. And yet emancipation came not simply to Black folk in 1863. This is powerful foregrounding of what Reconstruction will mean as well. Emancipation came not simply to Black folk in 1863. To white Americans came slowly a new vision and a new uplift, a sudden freeing of hateful mental shadows. At last, democracy was to be justified of its own children. The nation was to be purged of continual sin, not indeed all of its own doing, due partly to its inheritance in a sin and negation that gave the world the right to sneer at the pretensions of this republic. At last, there could really be a free commonwealth of men. Suddenly, there was reason in all this mad orgy. Not only is it the case that it's, of course, emancipation of everyone. Again, that's what Reconstruction will mean. Reconstruction will be universalizing project for the emancipation and equality of everyone. But the second piece, again, is this question of what democracy means, right? And the fact that, as he puts it, democracy had died save in the souls of Black folk. Black reconstruction of democracy in America, because it was Black people who had in their hearts, in their souls, the kind of access to a democracy that white Americans could not comprehend, right? When he says, I hope I can find it, when he's talking about the new song on 124, a great song arose. This is 2/3 of the way down. The loveliest thing born this side of the seas. It was a new song. It did not come from Africa, though the dark throb and beat of that ancient of days was in it and through it. It did not come, and this is the piece that I was looking for, just because it's fun. It did not come from white America, never from so pale and hard and thin a thing. It was a new song in its deep and plaintive beauty. Its great cadences and wild appeal wailed, throbbed, and thundered on the world's ears. So this new vision of democracy did not emerge from white society. It emerged from the legacy of enslavement and the struggle against it. Again, he says not from Africa, right? It comes from this struggle. It doesn't have a biological or a geographical or a territorial, it's kind of like essential foundation. It comes in and through this struggle. The struggle itself, as a dialectical progression, creates the possibility of a freedom that's better than the freedom that had been promised. This is such a fucking amazing chapter. I love it. The coming of the Lord is all of these things, right? Cool. What do folks think? Before I get to what folks think, I'll mention the fact that the next 2 chapters are, again, clearly a pair of chapters. First, looking backward, and then looking forward. As we've said, though, he kind of arranges these, he'd already arranged these 3 chapters as a kind of series, right? From enslaved general strike to Black soldier to free labor. The free labor overlaps with the looking backward, in part because the question is how to maintain the oppression of this newly freed labor, right? What resources and frameworks are available to planters in particular in a backward-looking sense to reconstitute the labor force, right? Looking forward, we'll then talk about two contradictory visions for what the future could look like beyond the existing status quo. So think of these as a kind of pair as we move toward looking backward next week. What kind of questions do folks have about the coming of the Lord?
We have a question from the chat. Why were European workers more willing to wage struggle for the abolition of slavery if their proletarian status was also contingent on cotton production?
Why were they willing to support the abolition of slavery if their proletarian status was contingent on cotton production? Because they understood that again, this is not absolute, it's a qualitative thing. More so in Europe, they understood that the abolition of formal slavery was part of a broader class struggle, right? Again, very rarely was it understood in so clearly and so straightforward a way. Although for someone like, Marx, we do see this stated, right? We see other working class organizations making this statement, which is to say that slavery constitutes a division which fragments and divides the working class, right? Again, from the very beginning, I've been comparing this to rhetoric around migration because it functions very much the same way, where migration does not hurt workers, migration enforcement hurts workers, right? Because that is a structure of hierarchy that divides the working class, and it's through equalizing and breaking, that sort of relationship and breaking down those barriers that you can begin to engage in what would be a higher level class struggle, right? So there are workers in Europe that understand it that way. There are other workers who are just abolitionists, right? Because far more people in Europe are abolitionists than in the US South in particular, right? And even than in the US North. Abolitionists in part because it's been abolished, right? It's, again, like, I don't want to give this too much credit. The British, did not abolish slavery because they thought it was morally wrong. They dress it up with the moral language after they've decided to abolish it because of concrete economic competitive interests, right? And the fact that their reliance on industrial labor allows for them to be more profitable in an industrial setting, right? There's a lot of things involved here, right? The British do not at this point have any kind of access to the kind of territory and labor that would allow slavery to become a fundamental and large motor of their sort of power, right? So they dress it up afterward, but it's real, right? Like, people find it comforting to say, my government does not support slavery, and I don't want it to ally with a government that's openly about the enslavement of Black people. You can never count on Europeans to go that far with it, right? But there's always this contradiction, this tension. Again, this is what C.L.R. James shows in the context of the French Revolution, where Haitian slaves rise up, and they say to French Jacobins, in other words, the left wing of the French representatives, they say, listen, doesn't this freedom and equality and opposition to, like, the metaphor of slavery not apply to actual slaves? And some of them say, well, no, because we need slavery because of this. And then some say, you know what, that's right. And they can be pushed to the left, right? And they can be pushed into a more radical position. So part of what James is showing us is that the Haitian slaves radicalize the French Revolution. They make it into a more radical process in France, which then has rebounding effects on what's happening in terms of abolition in the colonies, right? Something slightly similar you could see happening here, although on a lower level. But yeah. What else?
We have another question from the chat that says, what are examples of still existing blind spots today in the United States?
Examples of what? Sorry?
Still existing blind spots today.
The same fucking blind spot. The still existing blind spots, yeah. Still existing blind spots, yeah. So, yeah, as I mentioned already, what Du Bois calls the American blind spot is racism, white supremacy, and more specifically, the inability to comprehend how Black slaves rising up in struggle against the plantation system was a class struggle, right? Fast forward to the 1940s and 50s, C.L.R. James has to say again, Black struggles are proletarian struggles, right? They have this content, right? And he has to say it again that much later because it's still not understood in that way, right? Marxism has this way not the best Marxism, but the worst Marxism has this way of course, reducing things to questions of wage labor, only understanding class struggle through the category of wage labor, and that constitutes a blind spot. Why? Because the vast majority of Marxists on earth are not white, and yet the vast majority of wage laborers on earth are, right? Or wage labor has been the central core of specifically northern core, countries throughout history, right? Wage labor has been the relation that defines populations that emerge, in specific parts of the world. And so we don't understand much if we don't understand how to move beyond that framework. So it's a question of understanding how, this doesn't actually even get, all the way to the answer either, right? Because you can say, okay, black workers are workers, and white workers are workers. And this was the line of, say, the CPUSA historically. But the practical outcome of that line was to say, what we need to do is unite and fight, meaning we find the lowest common denominator on which black workers and white workers agree in the factory, and we'll fight on that basis, right? James's position, and the position in the political trajectory that I come from that leads us to read this book, for example, comes from a position that takes a very different view, which is to say, if there are hierarchies and divisions within the working class, fighting against those hierarchies is the way to unify the class, if that makes sense, right? So if there's a workplace in which white workers have this status and this wage and this sort of hiring, firing conditions, and black workers have a different and subjugated status within the same workplace, we don't try to figure out how we can get those workers to agree on a single platform. We begin from fighting against that division. And it's in the course of fighting against that division that you unify the struggle. But again, that's built on an idea that this blind spot is crucial to dividing the class, and that we need to overcome those barriers to the class. Right? So those blind spots persist. They persist in many different ways. It's not just a question of labor struggles, right? They persist in terms of what kinds of action matter and what kinds of action count, right? This again is central to this book. Maybe it's possible that on this reading of the book with you all, this piece has come more to the foreground for me, right? When we're talking about what kind of consciousness is built into the general strike, when we're talking about what kind of action is understood as revolutionary action, there's a sort of, traditional Marxist trajectory that would not understand what enslaved people were doing as a general strike, of course, right? And that you can follow a through line between that and people that today say, well, isn't it irrational to burn down your own neighborhood? Or isn't rioting irrational? Isn't it contradictory? Doesn't it sort of counteract what it is that people are asking for? Doesn't it hurt their own interests? Doesn't it hurt your cause? All of that is bullshit, right? But it's bullshit that's built on this idea that there's a certain kind of action that counts as rational and that counts as sort of properly revolutionary, when we actually know, and this is one of the first things that became very obvious to me all the way back in sort of like the Oakland rebellions when Oscar Grant was murdered, was that everyone would talk all day long about how rioting and rebelling didn't accomplish anything, but it was the only thing that accomplished anything, right? And so there's this deep irrational appeal to rationalism that is built as well into these kinds of blind spots. I mean, there's so many more, right? The broad blind spot of white supremacy leads to so many misunderstandings of the world, of its geography, its territory of struggle, of who is involved in struggle, of who can play a central role in that struggle. And these are the kind of barriers I think that we need to overcome. So yeah, that's a cool question. What else? Do folks in the room have anything else? We have one more in the room. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess what I found very, I guess the most interesting about reading about these conflicts, the way that Du Bois portrays and everything, is just that, almost so the actual emancipation of slaves in a lot of ways was really driven by a lot of conflict between the working class, between white workers and black workers, and kind of describing how it was the fact that northern white workers didn't want to support abolition, and leaving the army actually leads to more black workers being brought into the army, and actually in a way leads to the demise of the whole system. It just makes me think a lot in what ways that kind of conflict still exists today, with this division of white and black workers, and just politically the working class is in so many different directions. So it's is that struggle like similar? Is it like different in some ways? Like, is the resolution of that struggle like necessarily that we need to all unify, or are there ways that that conflict drives us closer to the demise of like, you know, the system and everything? But yeah, that's what I wonder.
No, it's a great question. It raises a lot of things that I was sort of like about to hesitate about earlier in terms of what has changed, right? But also, so I mean, first and foremost, I think the project, I mean, the task remains the same, which is to understand class unity as a project, right? If we either take the unity of all workers for granted, then we miss the actual texture and particularity, and specifically the role of white supremacy in undermining that unity, right? It leads to a sort of colorblind, blank understanding of what class struggle looks like, right? The privileging of certain voices, unionized, institutionalized voices over others, right? And so we need to understand that class as a project. This came up in the context of Occupy, right? So Occupy was like the 99% against the 1%. And then people were like, well, the 99% isn't exactly right. And if you do the math, 99% includes like people that are very, very wealthy. And so why would we, you know, and I think the mistake of that was to misunderstand the fact that it was meant to be and should be meant to be and understood as a project, right? What would it mean to build class unity in a certain kind of way? What would it mean to overcome gendered and racial divisions of that class? But that takes work, right? So on the flip side, in Occupy, again, this is just like thinking of really interesting prehistory for many of us, but also for myself in particular, where in Occupy Philadelphia, it was scandalous to have a POC caucus or a caucus that identified different sectors of the working class as oppressed in particular ways, right? Because that was seen as divisive. When the reality is that what is divisive is the structure of that fragmentation that needs to be overcome, right? And we don't overcome it by acting like it's not there. We overcome it by confronting it directly and moving past it. The hesitation that I almost had earlier, which your question raises, I think in very interesting ways, is the fact that particularly public sector workers are increasingly people of color in this country, right? That there's been this, it's part of the overall transformation of production in this country, so-called, offshoring, which is often like shifting of labor into the US South, right? To, find either migrant labor or unprotected, ununionized labor. But, it leads to all these sort of transformations in which you have many unionized public sector workers who are people of color, and that constitutes not only an economic but also a political constituency that is being targeted by Trump's sort of like Doge, sort of full assault on the federal government today, right? One of the main goals of this sort of mass attempt to fire federal workers is being framed under the idea that these are unproductive or people that don't show up for work or all of this. It's because they're people of color, right? It's because they're protected workers who are often people of color who also have a certain political orientation, which is not radical, but which tends toward, the liberal side of the equation of the Democratic Party, right? So we should understand the fact that this is an attack on workers, and the goal is to weaken that sort of working class constituency. And so it's really important to keep that in mind when we're thinking about how these pieces operate. But the kind of permanent power of white supremacy, and this piece in particular has gained power in the period specifically since the civil rights movement, right? US history is a long trajectory of institutions being broken down and being replaced, right? And they don't get replaced until they get broken down, right? So Jim Crow being overturned and being sort of overcome leads to, and we should always expect it to lead to, new institutions to do the work of white supremacy, right? Mass incarceration, policing, but also this broad demonization of the state as an institution that steals money through taxes from hardworking white people and gives it to undeserving poor people of color, right? That's a 50-year, 60-year shift in public perception that's been cultivated, and that's the language, of course, that's being used today and deployed. So it's when you talk about fairness, and it, of course, is reaching a fever pitch around DEI, which is we want to talk about merit, right? We want to hire the people that have the most merit. And that's absolutely code for white people. We know that, right? But you can see it as part of this sort of like historical trajectory of demonizing any kind of state intervention. And in this case, the state building of a federal working class, right? That's got to be dismantled as well. So they're, similar struggles, similar parameters for struggle, again, around migration. The question is, overcoming that false division between workers, that borders constitute that. Who was it that sort of great socialist thinker in the 20s referred to as the sword of Damocles dangling over the working class, which is migration enforcement, essentially, right? Where you can use so-called immigrant labor to break working class struggles, and that has the beneficial side effect of making those workers, domestic workers, think that those migrant workers are their enemies, right? And it's an incredibly powerful weapon that the state is able to use to break those struggles. So, yes. Cool. If there aren't any other questions, thank you all so much. I really appreciate you reading this chapter with us, and we will see you next week to discuss chapter 6, right? No, chapter 6. Looking backward. Yeah. Thank you all. Thank you.